Welcome to A Narrative of Love, a series of conversations with thinkers, leaders, and spiritual teachers about their understanding of love and how they see the significance of love in our personal and political lives. I'm Scherto Gill, and I'm your host of these conversations. With us today is Dr. Joy DeGruy, a US-based and internationally renowned researcher and educator. Her research has focused on the intersection of racism, trauma, violence, and American chattel slavery. Among her publications is the most celebrated book entitled Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome: America's Legacy of Enduring Injury and Healing. Dr. Joy DeGruy, so delighted to have you on this program. So I wanted to say that you are one of the strongest voices in the US and possibly in the world that address the historical wounds of slavery and that advocate the imperative of structural justice and collective healing. Absolutely. So the first question is, how did you get here? In terms of both the depth of your professional understanding of this very complex landscape and racism, slavery and healing, but also in terms of how did you manage to get yourself into so many prominent global platforms, be it national TV, popular radios, celebrity shows, international forums, university programs, and so on?
Wow, none of that sounds like I think, first of all, I was raised, my parents were from Louisiana, from the South. They were part of that exodus, that mass migration that Isabel Wilkerson talked about in her book, The Warmth of Other Suns. My family was seeking the warmth of other suns as well. But I was raised in an unusual way, in the sense that, one, my parents raised us to be very proud and to be very embracing of our Blackness, if you will. My father referred to himself as an Asiatic Black man before anybody was saying that. When people were still colored and Negroes, and he says, "No, I'm a Black man." And so we never had that kind of. We had an opposite feeling. We had a real embrace of our Blackness, a real interest. And of course, I grew up in the '60s, very influenced. My brother was very influenced, as was my father and uncles, by Malcolm X. And my brother was associated with the Black Panther movement. So I grew up in an activist kind of environment, right? But I think right away, as I began to look at what I consider a very strong spiritual base, and my spiritual base is that I believe in the fundamental oneness of all humanity. That's what I believe. I believe all people are one. That's a spiritual practice that I have had throughout my life. And so there was this dissonance that I began to feel early on as a child. And I always was the person, just to kind of give you an idea about me, I was always someone who shared my lunch with the kid that I knew didn't have one. I befriended the person that people ignored or picked on. That's who I've always been. And I started to notice something that African Americans were doing, people that look like me, to hurt one another. And I was curious about it. It was, this whole idea of calling you Black, and then they fill in the blank, you Black, whatever the word was, but they would say you were Black first. And as a child, that I didn't understand. So the assumption here is if I call you Black, that should harm you. That should upset you even more. It's an insult to you. And I'm going, but you are Black. Why is that an insult to you? You know what I mean? These were things I struggled with in my childhood. And as I became older, I became more acquainted with these notions of white supremacy. And I began to recognize that there is something that we internalize that, at least in my little community, in my little neighborhood, things that I heard, like, oh gosh, she's so pretty, even though she's so dark, right? Now, these are from Black people. So these were things like, even though, she's dark, she's pretty, oh, he was really attractive. He had, good hair, which means that you have hair free of kinks. You have hair that's more like white people's hair. And that was good hair. And in fact, a movie was made in 2009. Chris Rock made a movie called Good Hair. I mean, he's a comedian. He made fun of it, but he never dealt with the etiology of it. And that was the injury. And so even early on, I started seeing what I would call the symptoms of what ultimately became my life's work, to do the deep dive into how we came to see ourselves the way we have. And again, we're not a monolith. Black people are unique and diverse and complex, but I started to see it enough. I started to see it throughout the culture, and not just in America. And I started to recognize that there was this piece, this historical trauma that was informing what I was experiencing. And that was, in the case of America, American chattel slavery. And so from there, I started to do work. I have 4 degrees, 3 advanced degrees. I went into social work. I have a clinical degree in psychology. I started to look, generally speaking, at research as a means to try to understand what I was seeing and how to change it.
Could I just interrupt you here?
Sure.
You have 4 degrees and 3 higher degrees, 2 masters, 1 PhD. This is a very extraordinary. I mean, given the racist history in America, for an African American woman to achieve this much, can you unpack it yourself?
That is one of those, what's interesting about that. If you grew up in America, most African Americans are told as children, you can't just be average. You just can't be okay. You have to be twice as good in order for you to enter spaces that are even vaguely fair or just or equitable. You have to be twice as good. So I grew up with that mantra in my mind all the time. The irony is, I crossed the T's, I dotted the I's so that I could end up in the arenas where I could have influence. That's literally why I did it. The other part is that my actual body of work did not come from any of those degrees. I was not taught about me and my people and our contribution or our suffering or anything. It was something that you gloss over in Black History Month, maybe. And so, for me, it was a matter of making certain that I took the power out of the hands of people that would try to marginalize me. Having 4 degrees shut folks down. It stopped them from, again, making certain assumptions. And, again, I was taught as a child, you have to be twice as good. So I'm going to walk in with everything more than you say is required.
God, that's extraordinary, to work twice as hard and to be able to get here. But I wanted to zoom into something which really struck me as very significant when I listened to your lectures, and that is, you talk about racism as a form of structured dehumanization. But you also suggested that in the US, for people to live in such kind of race, to be able to live in such a racist society, it requires what you call it cognitive dissonance. To reconcile, on the one hand, is this American ideal, we're born equal, and the equality and justice, with this kind of everyday treatment of people from ethnic minority background, such as African Americans, such as indigenous people. So would you say more about that? But in particular, I'd like you to say more about the long-term effect. Like you said, even the Black people self-denigrate, but long-term effect, those kind of cognitive dissonance on people, all people, not just the African Americans, indigenous Americans, but also people of other skin tones and people of European descent.
Sure. I think that, and I'm asked that question often because I've done such a deep dive in terms of the impact it has had on people of African descent and Indigenous people and other people of color here in the United States. But what happens is, you see, when you assert yourself to be superior, if you demonize, oppress, subjugate people, you lose your own humanity. The result is your own sense of humanity gets thwarted and distorted and perverted. And in order to live, coexist in a society that really promotes this notion of democracy and freedom, and then, for all intents and purposes, maintaining a sense or a form of slavery, whether that was the initial slavery or whether that was a sharecropping, which was another form of slavery, or, mass incarceration and the use of prisoners for cheap labor. All of it speaks to basically assaulting our humanity. And because, remember, I believe humanity is one. So I don't believe that these things can be done in isolation and not have extreme impacts on Europeans. Again, it robbed them of the ability to totally and fully embrace what is true, because the dissonance is, if I am superior and I am moral and I am intelligent and I am civilized, how do I reconcile behaving in barbaric ways? How do I reconcile genocide of people and capture, selling, mutilation, breeding of people? How do I reconcile that? And so what I have to do, and this is where that dehumanization piece comes in. It mustn't be me. It must be you. And I'm doing what you deserve. And so there was all of this, I guess there had to be this huge collusion, if you will, of every major institution in America had to say, yes, this was okay. They deserve it. And the only way you could do that is to demonize the people upon whom you are oppressing. So you say it's their fault. It's like, even if Europeans, you go back to European history and you look at women, white women, and they were so important. They grew food. They were some of the first medicines. Medical people. They were the folks who figured out how to preserve food. They were very important, very powerful. But with renaming them, we can change all of our behavior towards them. We can call them witches. Those very same people that gather up herbs and poultices and create medicines, well, they also create brews. And then now we've labeled you, which we've done, we've relabeled you. And therefore now the behavior we are exhibiting, it fits that label for you. And that's all you need, is that label. And Black people were labeled everything: lazy, dangerous, violent, all of these things. Oh, so they deserve to be treated this way. And then everyone can go to sleep and go to church and do all the things that feel good. But that dehumanization piece has been done with people, not just people of African descent, but throughout the world. And then once you dehumanize people, you can put them in ovens, for example, right? You can do all of these horrific things to them because, they deserve it. There's something wrong with them. And so for me, I think that's what I recognize, is that, you rob yourself of your own humanity when you lie, when you have to be complicit with things that are horrific, right? It takes something away from you. And like anything else, if you lie, the problem with a lie is that you have to keep up with it. See, if you tell the truth, you have to keep up with the truth. You have to go, oh my God, I told that lie. So, oh my God, they're getting ready to go talk to, Deborah. I better call Deborah because Deborah doesn't know the lie. Well, that's America. America has been burying the lies, and they've metastasized. They've come to the surface, and the whole world now can see. And so I think this is an opportunity for us. It's not new to people of color. None of this was new. But now the world can see, and perhaps change can happen.
I interrupted you when you started talking about your journey, and I'm just going to jump because I realize I read your books and I listened to your lectures, and for the work we do together for UNESCO, I have an acquaintance with you. Maybe it's not fair for the for the audience of this program. Let's just return to your starting point. You talk about your journey of becoming and your education and your research and so on. But I just want to pick one part. in your own journey of becoming, you wrote in the book, you went to Africa, and that was an extended trip, and you met with many African women. And but I also remember you mentioned in your book, and one of the African women came to you and said, look, Africa would not forget you. You are Africa, even you are 400 or 300 years from home. So I felt deeply moved when I read that part. So I wanted to hear from you, being part of the African American community yourself, growing up, listening to all these, you're going to later on talk about your book and talk about the post-traumatic slave syndrome, just witnessing that. But yet this journey must have been part of your own healing. So what is your journey of healing? And how do you go through your own process of reckoning in order to arrive at this place?
I think my journey, people ask me all the time, how it's because it's weighty, it's heavy. I mean, when you read the book, there's heavy stuff. Now, and I left out a lot of heavy stuff. But it is heavy because I love my people. I love all people, generally speaking, but I love Black people. I love African American people and who we are and who we've become. And this notion that we are the pupil of the eye. Every pupil is Black. It beholds what is before it. We are the pupil of the eye. And that is a metaphor that has been attributed to African American people, to Black people, people of African descent. And so I think my journey has been one of holding on to that truth, that we are fundamentally one people. And I look at people and I give everybody an opportunity. I give everybody an opportunity to grow, everybody an opportunity to change. But I also recognize that, there's an African proverb. African proverb says, when you pray, move your feet. And what that says is it's not enough to just sit back and hope real hard or even pray about it. We have to act upon what we believe is true and fair and just. And I think my journey has been coming from, let me put it in this kind of phrasing. There is a book that talks about faith and what faith is. And faith embodies three particular realities: to believe in your heart, to confess with your tongue, and to make evident in your actions. And I think that because I believed so strongly in this notion of the beauty, wonder, and grace, and dignity, and brilliance of Blackness, of being a person of African descent, I believe that deeply in my heart. I realized that I was living in an environment that was telling me the opposite of that. And so therefore, I needed to act upon what I knew, upon what I believed. It needed every Black child to know that they were intrinsically noble, and that there was nothing that they needed to fix in themselves. I needed everyone to know what I believed. So I had to walk it. I had to do the research. I had to do that deep dive. I had to unpack my own injuries so that my children would not receive them, so that I myself could exemplify by what I say I believe. And if I'm exemplifying that, not doing harm, not transmitting trauma further, I have to do my own work and look at mine so that I don't inadvertently pass those injuries on to my own children and they to their children. And I can say honestly that they may have their own issues, but they don't have mine. Okay, I did not transmit the hurt because they didn't experience my trauma. They have no reason to have to carry it. And so that's part of what my work is. It's about not just, looking at past, but looking at who you are and the trajectory for the future.
Now, so when you were with those African women and those women came up to you and embraced you, And for someone to say that, look, you're here now, you're home, even though you were 400 years from home. So how does it make you, how did that moment make you feel? And what does it say about the kind of love the kind of, you said, we have to respect ourselves and to see the beauty in ourselves. I would say that maybe that's a form of self-love. And so what does the return to Africa and have that experience make you feel about love, healing, and belonging?
Wow, so powerful. It was transformative, actually, honestly, Scherto. It was transformative because it was I could tell you that the context, and I actually had another experience I wrote about in the revised book that I never talked about, but I wrote about it in the revised book. But I can remember all of the anticipation of being in Africa, all the things I'd read and heard, people that I knew, and I just was, so hopeful and so full. But I'll tell you, the very first thing that struck me was, when I would go to the villages. For 6 weeks, there were 9 of us African-American women traveling throughout 5 countries in the southern region of Africa. And so we would always want to go to the villages. I never wanted the tourist stuff. I wanted to be where the people were. And when we would arrive at these villages, the people would, of course, start talking to us in whatever their language was. But they were greeting us. And no matter what village we went to, no matter what part of the southern region we were traveling in, the greeting was, "I see you." I see you is the greeting, right? Like we'll say, "Hey, what's up? How you doing?" They're saying, "I see you." And it was such a profound feeling of being seen, of being normal, of having this sense of normalcy. It was such a powerful moment for me. And so as I began to really embody that sense of being seen, I recognized how invisible we were in the United States, that we've been erased. Our culture was they attempted to erase. They attempted to erase us and all of these things. And I realized the moment I go back to the continent, they say, "But I see you." And then I realized the connection with all of those years of enslavement and trauma. There's something that African Americans do. They do it to this day, 2021. I live in the South, and so it's really common here where you'll see another Black person and they always give you the nod. It's a nod, or and for all my life, this is as a child, we're in the supermarket and people are doing this, and we're walking down the street and people are doing this. And of course, all my white friends are like, "Gosh, you people, so many people." I'm going, "I don't know those people," right? But what they're saying to me and what I say when I nod is, if no one else sees you, I see you. And there is a feeling of belonging that evokes. And I ask everybody who has that experience, is that don't think through it, feel through it. What does it feel like when a perfect stranger nods and acknowledges you? And it's a truly an African-American thing, because maybe it wasn't always safe for us to acknowledge each other, but we gave that symbol to one another. I see you. You're not invisible. You're important. You're valued. You're loved. I mean, and it was profound. It was life changing, because it was after that I wrote the book.
Beautiful. Now let's talk about your book. And just tell us, what is it like an everyday for an African American to live with this trauma? What are those symptoms of living out we know PTSD, but what is the PTSS?
Well, it's interesting because they're related. They're not the same by any stretch. And I had to do a great deal to make certain that people did not try to create this sense of a disorder. It's not a disorder, right? People who were directly impacted by any trauma often, results in stress-related illness. There's no doubt about that. Matter of fact, one trauma will produce stress-related, injury. People would end up with PTSD from an indirect trauma, finding out about something that happened to someone they loved, not even being directly impacted themselves. There were a number of people that were impacted by 9/11 that weren't there, you know? And so there's this notion of trauma and what you do with it. And we're not talking about what made the African-American experience unique was that it was over hundreds of years. What about hundreds of years of trauma? And and it's so amazing, it seems like we'll look at everybody else's trauma, but we wouldn't look at ours. We wouldn't look at, it's as though, oh yeah, you know, they're so strong, they're resilient. Yeah, we're that too. But, you know, you're impacted by a couple hundred years of trauma. It's impossible not to have been. The question that happens then, if I have been traumatized, and this is kind of the math I did on the front end, and I looked at specific things like violence. That's what I looked at in my clinical work. I looked at violence among African-American male youth. I wanted to see the connection between historical trauma, their idea of how they were socialized, what they were socialized to believe about themselves, you know, and this whole idea of, you know, just what the larger society was doing. So we're looking at racist socialization. We're looking at violence. And then we're looking at this whole idea of the self-esteem. What do we believe about who we are, right? So, but when you start looking at it and unpacking it, if I've been traumatized, let's just say, let's move it back a couple hundred years, and I've been traumatized, let's say I have post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of it. You know, somebody beat me, raped me, took my child, whatever the reason, I am now, as a mother, exhibiting symptoms of stress-related illness as a result of a traumatic event. But I don't have access to any help. I don't have access to a diagnosis. I don't have access to a doctor. I don't have access. I have my community, whatever that community happens to be at that moment, that tries to kind of hold me together. But I'm healing the best way I can, but I'm still exhibiting the behaviors. But I have children that I'm modeling that behavior for. So not only am I experiencing this trauma myself, I'm trying to hold it together, but my children are learning from what they're seeing. And unfortunately, it's not just me that's been traumatized. It's all the people around them that have been traumatized. So after a while, the behavior begins to become normalized. And I think that that's the piece that's so important. Can I read a piece? This is a piece that actually is from Isabel Wilkerson's cast. And I call it This House. She doesn't, but I call it This House because I introduce my audience to her work. We in the developing world are like homeowners who inherit a house on a piece of land that is beautiful on the outside, but whose soil is unstable, loam and rock, heaving and contracting over generations, cracks patched, but the deeper ruptures waved away for decades, centuries even. Many people may rightly say, I had nothing to do with how this all started. I have nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never attacked indigenous people, never owned slaves. And yes, not one of us was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it, but here we are, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks and bold walls and fissures built into the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We did not erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours to deal with now, and any further deterioration is in fact on our hands. Unaddressed, the ruptures and diagonal cracks will not fix themselves. The toxins will not go away, but rather will spread, leach, and mutate as they already have. When people live in an old house, they come to adjust to the idiosyncrasies and outright dangers skulking in an old structure. They put buckets under a wet ceiling, prop up groaning floors, learn to step over that rotting wood tread in the staircase. The awkward becomes acceptable, and the unacceptable becomes merely inconvenient. Live with it long enough, and the unthinkable becomes normal. Exposed over the generations, we learn to believe that the incomprehensible is a way that life is supposed to be.
God.
I don't know that I've ever heard it articulated quite so well. But she captured in this house, in this metaphor, in this analogy, in this story, she captures what has happened. And the house is still standing. And some houses are in need of repair. Some just need to be shored up, and some aren't going to make it. But what I recognize about post-traumatic is that when people know better, they tend to do better. And the book and the information has helped people get curious about themselves and their lives, curious about whether what I have received to survive is something I want to pass along to my children. Is it where did it come from? And who were the people that gave it to me? To begin to examine our agency, if you will, but to examine it in such a way to say, how much do I take with me? What do I let go of in order to move forward?
I think on an everyday basis, one of the greatest challenges that we all face is the discomfort when we are confronted with racism. So recognizing the issue as like what you have unfolded in your book, as a collective of the collective grief, trauma, and the injustice that people of color have endured is one thing. But like you said, to be able to, or to know, or how to engage with it is another. So we tend to see kind of two opposite reaction. One is positive, you may call it positive discrimination. Well, look, I'm not racist. I really love Black people. My closest friend is Black, and so yeah, look, I'm all there, and the Black people are so beautiful, and so on. And the other kind is probably, you may call it active disassociation. Oh, I can't say anything anyway, because whatever I say, they would think I'm racist. So I better just keep away from it.
Sure.
So these the common kind of reaction people have. It's all to do with the way that we are unable to deal with the discomfort.
Absolutely.
The discomfort, and so much so we either cover our eyes, or we try to look at everything in rosy eye. Because racism is complex. It's complex because we cannot just say, oh, this is a racist society, but it had nothing to do with it. And so what is in your research and in your work, and recognizing this post-traumatic slave syndrome is one thing. How do you engage with people, and such as those people who don't know how to deal with the discomfort, to embark on the journey of healing? And where do you start?
Well, it's interesting because it's very different when I'm working with people of color, Indigenous people, Latinx folks. It's a very different experience than when my audience is white or white and mixed audiences. It's a different approach, right? So part of what happens with my work, something I didn't actually know was going to happen when I started looking at it, but it started resonating. Let me give you a perfect example of how deeply the work resonates with people of color throughout the world. I had no idea. I had no idea it would resonate with people around the world. I was looking at my little world and trying to figure out how I could help in it. That was my goal. I teach a 10-week graduate level online course about my book. At the end of basically the introductory course, I talk about models of change. I talk about models of healing. Right? What ends up happening normally is people say, oh, can I just have your model? And I say, no, this is heart work. You've got to go through this process so that you can fully understand the nature of the injury, so that you might not unintentionally cause more injury. I said, this is not something, and again, I find that white people always want, give me the bullet points, because I don't want to go in here. I don't want to mess with what's in here. I just need you to give me the bullet points. I said, this is not how we can heal. It's not bullet points. You've got to get out of between your ears and into your heart. And the work through that 10 weeks gets you to your heart. You are not the same at the end of that 10-week course. In one of my sessions, I believe it was last fall, I can't remember, there was a young woman who wrote me, who became a student from India. And she said to me, she was working on her PhD, and she said, I used your work. I am from the Dalit, the untouchable class. And I now know how to save my people. You will never know. I still get chills when I hear that. I get chills because she saw in my work the ability to work with people that when I looked at the treatment of the Dalit people, I was so humbled. I was overwhelmed. I mean, literally, I was so emotional. I couldn't believe it when she started to tell me about the lives, current lives, and the last 2,000 years lives of the Dalit people. And here was this, you talk about amazing woman who emerged out of that, went back to school, got her degrees, and says, I'm going to help my people. And so for them, it resonates because, again, it's I see you. It's I completely embrace your reality. And then when I work with white people, what I tend to have to do is, one, I said, your guilt is not helpful. It's not helpful for us. It's not helpful to you. That's not what this is about. This is not about guilt. This is about recognizing that we are all responsible for the repair of this house. And none of us were there, but we're all responsible for the condition under which we live. And so I think people, when they know better, they'll do better. Those who are afraid began to realize I do have a voice. And whether I like it or not, Peggy McIntosh would say, you have white privilege, spend it well. Spend it well. And that's what I think happens for white people. And what needs to happen is to recognize, let's not debate about whether you have it. Neither one of us was here when the house was built, but you have privilege. You were born with it, white skin privilege. How are you going to spend it? And so that to me becomes the, not even the dichotomy. We're working together in this, in our own lanes, in whatever way that we can make things right or better or heal. And that's what the healing's about. It's about all of us as a united humanity, recognizing that this is a house. If we're going to fix it, we have to do it together.
It feels like, this is my own interpretation, I feel there's at the center of this, as you said, we're not talking about blaming. We're not talking about any kind of a guilt, but we are talking about, for me, I would interpret it as a radical ethics of love. It's almost like love is a radical ethic in your work. And that can be a pathway to social transformation. So I go over to you.
Interesting.
So why love? If that can be a love, a radical ethic, why love? And what kind of love are we talking about here?
I think that love, like faith, is conscious knowledge. It's an action word. It's an action word. I believe, if you want to get deep, I believe it's love that causes the atoms to be attracted. I think that love is one of those things, like, when I would come into workshops, this is a perfect example. I would come into workshops and I know that fundamentally, and it's just not more than a notion. It's not just, oh, it's nice if we just loved each other. It's really true. Okay. The reality, it's really true. But you can't start a workshop going, we just need to love each other. People it would be a hot mess. So what I did learn, though, about this whole idea of love in action, that love itself has, it's key. So let me we use other words for stuff. For example, we grow up in the sciences, mental health sciences, and we talk about the subconscious mind, right? The subconscious mind, which is not you can't find it. Okay, you cannot. It's not a thing. You can't actually. It has no material reality. Yet we'll say, there's a subconscious mind, and people accept that. But what if you said you have a spirit, or you have a soul? You see, that's not acceptable in certain arenas. But subconscious mind is, and you can't see either of them. But the point is that when we start looking at evidence, right? We start looking at love as evidence. I started to look at implicit bias, right? Implicit bias. And there are all kinds of ways to actually test for bias, right? We know that there's been a number of them. One is called the IAT. And in this, people have to determine whether or not they're seeing a Coke bottle or a wallet or a gun. And then there's a face that flashes just in a second, black face or white face. And they started looking at this, and they could say, if you associate more guns with the black face after seeing the black face, then we know that you're connecting blackness with, So anyway, long story short, they did this with police officers. Most of the people were white police officers. And then they tried something to see if they could somehow decrease the amount of bias. So they showed them these scenarios. They engaged them in these scenarios in which a black person rescues or saves the white person, and the person that's the perpetrator is white, and that the black person saves them. And they become a part of this scenario, and they start engaging in it. And they were able to, listen to me, reduce bias 48% in one sitting. So now, as a social scientist, I need to unpack what just happened. Why is that? Because a person was somehow impacted in such a way that they felt empathy, that they felt love, that they didn't think could happen. But now we're talking about an artificial situation, because normally they would never find themselves in a situation with the black person, which is the problem. Our separation, we can keep the lies going. Oh, they're dangerous. You want to be with them, and they're all of these things. But you see, it's just like light is dispelled, and darkness is dispelled with light. The darkness doesn't have the power to stay there once light enters the room. And in the same way, when you have love and you have truth that combine, it destroys the lie, and we can feel each other. So I looked at that whole thing. Virtual reality is even more significant in reducing bias. Virtual reality. Well, what is the virtual reality we're talking about? Could it be that you love me, that you care about me, that I'm your friend? Because you see, once we get there, there's no question. And so we're trying to create artificial ways to find love. The quickest route is through your heart and with me, to engage with me. But people who are afraid or who believe the lies will get as close as virtual reality and will find themselves for the first time feeling empathy and love.
So love is a movement. Love is action. Love is that which moves us towards each other.
Yes.
Love is that kind of shorten the distance that exists. Maybe even break down the walls and whatever fortification we put in between us, and so that we are drawn together. So would that relational process be a starting point for societal healing? So you often talk about education, because that's one of the areas you work, and you worked with Black boys and so on in education. So what can education do in terms of applying this ethic of love and this kind of radical ethic of love in this movement?
Absolutely.
We can become closer, and when we're close to each other, then you can empathize with another human being rather than imagining the fear of something that you don't really know.
Right. And so, you basically just kind of said what it is that I do, actually, because I have a couple of evidence-based models. One of them is called the relationship approach. right? And I used it in schools. I wrote the model back in the 90s and have since, of course, rewritten and tweaked it. But it's very powerful. It was based on the premise that of the work of Dr. Edwin Nichols around axiology in the study of values. And long story, Dr. Nichols, whom I love, basically trained me to understand the manner in which, the way in which Black people have moved through the world through millennia, through thousands of years, not a couple of hundred, or in America. Who are we, right? And that's his research. And he came up with his philosophical aspects of cultural difference. And one particular area of it really lit me up. And it was that idea that the highest value in African Latinx culture is the relationship between people. So I wrote and created something called the relationship model, and consequently the relationship approach. In other words, the relationship is in itself the key, because the highest value is in the relationship. By utilizing a model that puts at its center my connection with you, which most people don't want to do. It's hard work. When I say it's hard work, it's true. If you cannot connect with children, you don't need to be in front of them, especially children of color. It's not just a notion, it's a reality. And if you look at every program throughout the United States that's working with people of African descent or Latinx people, before they can even explain to you what it is, you're going to hear the word relationship come out. We build relationships with parents, with teachers, with students, with community, with village. That's the answer. It always has been. And we have, we make fancy names for it, but the reality is you need to be able to get to your heart, which is that love piece that you're talking about. My kids know I love them. That's why I can correct them, no matter where I am.
Yes, relationship at human level, like in schools and community, workplace, and so on. So there's a possibility. However, that relational process, take it to structure level. I wonder what it will look like. And I think one of the greatest African-American feminist philosophers is Bell Hooks.
Bell Hooks, yeah.
Yeah, and she said that there cannot be love without justice. Yes. And so I don't believe for one moment that Bell Hooks means that love must be conditional. It doesn't mean that. But how else might we understand her proposal here? And how does love sit comfortably with justice? And what is the interconnection between love and justice?
So powerful. I love these questions, because there's so much of what I believe. There's a wonderful quotation that says that the purpose of justice is the appearance of unity amongst men, which essentially means you can't have unity without the justice. People like the kumbaya photo op kind of notion, right? We are the world, but the rubber meets the road when we can be just and equitable, right? And the bottom line is, like I've been telling everybody, and I think it's wonderful that they're taking down statues, they're changing the name of sports teams, they're taking Aunt Jemima off the jar or whatever. That's all great. But at the end of the day, are we going to have a just society? And meaning that, because everybody keeps talking about getting back to normal, right? They keep saying, let's get back to normal. Joy doesn't want to go back to normal. Let me be on record saying I don't want to go back to normal, because normal is disparity. Normal is police use of deadly force. Normal is white supremacy. Normal is disproportionality. All of those things are what normal has been. I don't want to get back to that. Which means that if we really are about trying to create change, whatever your perspective of that is, it means that must be a just change. And that's the reality. If again, when you start looking at anti-Blackness, you begin to realize it is a foundation. If in America, this is a foundation. If we can get this right in America, the rest of the world will follow. That's an absolute truth. And we've got to get to this and get to it quickly. Because where we are now, we can't unknow what we've seen the past year. We can't unknow it. Nobody can sit back and go, I didn't know. I wasn't aware. It was just a fringe. No, we've got to clean this one out. We got to either take the house down and rebuild it in some cases. Sometimes we just need to remove parts of it, which is, again, structural and institutional stuff, or we shore up what we have. But one thing's for sure, we cannot continue as we have. If this is going to be a just and equitable society, it means that we got to share the goods. And that's, again, that's where every people get right up to that and think that we don't have to go any further. And we must. This justice implies that there has to be fairness and equitable resources, which have never existed for people of color in America. So, yeah, two-pronged approach. Yes, I need to heal. Yes, we need to engage. Yes, we have to get back to this mutuality that we experience as human beings. But once again, when you pray, move your feet. We got to have action, and that has to be represented in the institutions that continue to perpetuate the harm. The institutions, people say to me all the time, Joy, what can we do to fix policing? Fix policing? Policing works perfectly well. It works the way it was designed to work and not on our behalf. That's the reality. Every system, that the results is what it's designed to get. I said, so we keep going, oh, wow, fix it. No. This is one where it's poison at the root, based on slave patrols. We shouldn't be surprised what happened to Emmett Till. We shouldn't be surprised what happened to George Floyd or Breonna or Tamir or Trayvon. It's born out of terrorism. And we know it. We know it. So this is something where, again, we have to apply that knowledge in such a way that we begin to either dismantle some of these institutions that are never going to produce any positive results because they're designed to not. Starting with the Constitution, right? The Constitution of the United States was not made, it wasn't for everybody. It was made for white men with money and land. Period. And so we had to adjust to that. We had to change it. We had to do amendments. We had a civil war, meaning that there's so much that needs to be repaired here. At least there's a chance because now it's exposed. Now people aren't buying the lies anymore. So here is an incredible opportunity. But like I said, a lot of people, they'd rather burn this country to the ground before they share it. And I think we're there. I think we're on the precipice. But I think there are more people that want to save it than want to destroy it.
For those people on two sides, one is just a positive discrimination. The other side is just active dissociation. Where do we start to, if love is that action is movement to shorten the distance between people? So where do you advise us to get started?
I always start at home. At first, you start at home. And I mean that very, very seriously. I've written a study guide to my book to help people operationalize in their own personal lives, in your own space. It's also designed to be able to work in community and with families. But I think the first work, or the work to actually get us to that radical love, which is action, is one where you begin to see in your scope of power. What is your scope here, in terms of what you can actually do. And then to say, what can I do within those arenas? Like I talk often with parents. They say, well, I'm at home. I said, you work with children. You work with people in the community. I said, you have a lane that you clearly are in, that you can make some differences in. But it starts with me and figuring out, what is my locus of control? What are my resources? Who are the partners that I can gather with me in this process? All of us have that opportunity every single day. We do. It's a matter of whether or not we're going to move on that. We're going to operate on that. So that level of awareness, and then taking and moving it into an action. A measurable something that you can look at and say, I moved from here, the point of knowing, to the point of doing. And I say that that's huge. People have, minimal resources. People have a lot of resources. I'm saying, I don't care what you have. You can do the work, and you can do your part to move us towards that more unified, whole humanity, healthy humanity.
So thank you so much, Dr. DeGruy, for sharing your narrative of love.